Um, Great. So I'll go ahead and get started. First of all, my name is Amanda Pearlstein. I am an attorney here at Disability Rights New York. And I work in the PATB program, which is for the protection advocacy for people with traumatic brain injuries. I've been in this program for over 2 years now, and I've worked with a lot of individual clients who are living with the effects of TBI. And this project kind of came out of an issue that we'd observed in members of the community who had served in the military and were discharged other than honorably because of behaviors due to their TBI. And I'll kind of get in throughout this presentation, going into a lot of detail about what that means, what an other than honorable discharge, the effect it has on a person and on their life, their ability to get services, to get education, employment, healthcare. But so what we're going to be talking about today is about how your discharge status can be upgraded so that you are considered a full veteran and are given the full benefits that you're entitled to as a veteran of U.S. military service. So that's kind of just the big picture overview of the presentation. A couple more things. This project was funded by the New York Bar Foundation, a grant from the New York Bar Foundation, which we are very pleased to have. And this project has been about educating the community about traumatic brain injury in military service members and how to get these statuses upgraded. We're looking forward to kind of expanding the scope of it in the future. And then just kind of a disclaimer that, I myself did not serve in the military and I'm not familiar on a personal level with how these processes work. I've researched them heavily. I've spoken with people in the community, spoken with the Division of Veterans Services and others, but if you are a veteran or a former service member and you're seeing this and thinking, this isn't right, you have this information wrong, or this is how it's supposed to work, but it's really not how it works in real life, please let me know and we can discuss it in the Q&A. That's really important. And it's always most important to hear from the people who have lived experience and have seen how things play out in practice, not just in theory. All right, so let's go on ahead and get started with the presentation. So I'm just going to start with an overview of the numbers, just so you can get a sense of the scope of the issue with military service members and traumatic brain injury. So I've obtained these numbers from the U.S. Department of Defense website. They keep track of the number and types of injuries of TBI that people sustain in the military. So in 2019, which is the most recent complete year of data that we have, 20,118 U.S. service members sustained a TBI in that year alone. And I'm going to go through the categories here. It lists categories. You can see it has mild, moderate, severe, and penetrating. So just so you guys have a sense of what these definitions mean. A mild TBI is essentially the same thing as a concussion. It is a confused, disoriented state that can last up to 24 hours, or loss of consciousness up to 30 minutes, or memory loss lasting less than 24 hours. That's the criteria, that's the cutoff they put for when a TBI is mild. And I do think a lot of people don't recognize the severity of concussions because most of us had at least one concussion as a child, falling out of a tree or a sports injury. And we kind of view it as something where you walk it off, you'll be fine. And more we're learning that is not the case, that the science is showing that having a concussion, and especially having repeat concussions, does cause long-term damage and can lead to lifelong impairment if not treated properly. So just because a TBI is mild doesn't mean it's not going to pose an issue for somebody during and after their military service. And as you can see here, 82.5% of the TBIs sustained in the military are considered mild. And then you have a moderate TBI, which is a confused or disoriented state that lasts longer than 24 hours, or you're knocked unconscious for more than 30 minutes, but less than 24 hours, or you have memory loss lasting more than 24 hours, but less than 7 days. I'm not going to quiz you on this. This is just information that I think is helpful to know because it kind of just defines these categories and breaks them down, right? So of the injuries sustained, about 45,000, and the pie chart I'm looking at here, this is 2000 to 2020. So this is a 20 years of these injuries that are being reported. So in total, that would be 430,720 military TBIs over the course of 20 years. So yeah, about 10% are moderate, and then severe TBIs, confused or disoriented state lasting more than 24 hours, loss of consciousness for more than 24 hours, memory loss for more than a week. And then a penetrating TBI or an open head injury, that's essentially what it sounds like. The skull, the brain matter is actually penetrated by an object like a bullet or some kind of projectile. So that's the most severe category, of course, and it does account for a very small percent of injuries. It accounts for about 1.5%. But over time, of course, that adds up. That is quite a lot of people who end up suffering those kinds of injuries. So when we look at these numbers and what it means for New York State, which is the area that DRNY serves, there are around 838,000 veterans total living in New York State. And up to 19% of veterans are living with a TBI. So just simple math there, that breaks down to as many as 159,000 veterans with TBI in New York State. It is a large population, larger than I think many people realize. And then just to talk a little bit more about what happens to service members with a TBI while they're serving. A lot of, obviously, if you're in a severe case where you're in the hospital, that's its own thing. But if you get a concussion, if you get a mild TBI, the general rule is that you're supposed to return to full duty within 10 to 14 days. So you're supposed to rest and then kind of progressively return to activity. There's like go back. Standardized kind of program for that. Not everyone is able to really follow that. Like, sometimes you'll be encouraged to return to duty too soon after a concussion. And that can lead to your symptoms lasting for longer. It can lead to issues with your performance in the military, more accidents, and an increased risk of subsequent concussions. That is something to be careful about. And, often people feel pressured to return to duty quicker or choose to, or are forced to. There's a whole range of reasons why somebody would return to duty before they're ready. But I just want to highlight that as kind of the accepted time frame for returning to full duty after injury. All right, so moving on to the next slide. Okay, so this chart kind of breaks down the data that I presented on the previous page for the last 10 years. So TBI in the military, 2010 to 2020. So as you can see from this chart, the number of traumatic brain injuries in the military peaked in 2011, and the total number there was 32,834. That was the peak year. It has been on a downhill trajectory ever since, thankfully, with some minor upticks like you can see in 2019 there. But what this does mean is that every year kind of collectively, like more and more people are returning to society who have TBI, and that's been kind of an ongoing, like there will always be more people being added cumulatively to this chart. And this covers people, this is people who, so veterans living with TBI, it can be people who served in Vietnam, it could be people who served in the post 9/11 era combat, and it can also be people who did not serve in combat or who served during peacetime. A TBI during military service does not have to be combat related to count as having been sustained during service. A lot of people get TBIs from training exercises, from sports accidents, from car crashes, motorcycle accidents. These are all things that commonly happen if you're serving in the military and that are not combat related. For injuries that are sustained during combat, the detonation of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, and indirect fire account for about 60% of battle casualties. So these blasts, this explosion, the shock waves themselves can cause severe brain injury, as well as obviously the impact of being hit by them. So thanks to modern armored vehicles, body armor, improvements in care in the field and in military hospitals, U.S. service members are surviving attacks that would have been fatal in previous conflicts. If you're looking at, say, the ratio of being killed to wounded, or wounded to killed rather, in the war in Afghanistan is 7.4 to 1. So 7.4 times as many people are injured as are killed. If you compare that back to World War II, it's 1.7 to 1. So nearly as many people killed as injured. The number for the Vietnam War is 2.6 to 1. So basically what that means is the military is getting better and better at saving the lives of soldiers, right? So more people are surviving, but that also means that more people are returning home with these injuries, and specifically with brain injuries. I also just kind of wanted to make a note here about diagnosis of TBI and diagnosis of PTSD. So, a lot of us know about the very high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in military service members. And there are a lot of symptoms between TBI and PTSD that are co-occurring, right? if you're coming home from service and you're experiencing fatigue, irritability, insomnia, these are all things that can be attributed to TBI or PTSD and could very easily have been caused by both. And that makes it really hard to diagnose and to treat these invisible injuries that are co-occurring. And it makes it really problematic for doctors and for patients to really understand. I apologize for the motorcycle noise in the background. I am Brooklyn based and everything is very loud, despite my best efforts. There's also scientific evidence increasingly that shows that having a traumatic brain injury can in itself increase the risk and severity of PTSD. Essentially, it's going to make you more vulnerable to having PTSD symptoms after experiencing a trauma. So that's just interesting to keep in mind. And I think what that shows is that, if you were to chart out the incidence of PTSD in the military, the chart might look kind of like this one. You'd see kind of similar peaks and valleys. All right, I'm going to move on here to the next slide. So this leads into kind of the main focus of this presentation, which is TBI and bad paper discharge. So what does bad paper mean? If you are affiliated with the military, you probably understand this term, but a lot of us, like I said, do not come from that world. And so bad paper refers to any discharge category that is less than honorable. And on the next slide, I'm going to go into the major categories of discharge. And you'll see that, there's honorable discharge and there are several categories below it. So how can a TBI lead to you being discharged in a way that's less than honorable? So when you have a TBI, and this is not for every individual with a TBI because every brain works differently, every person is different, but in general, what you would see is an increase in mood and behavioral changes, mood swings, aggression, impulsivity, and lower inhibitions in terms of high-risk behavior. So you can see that being a combination of traits that could get really problematic for people who are in an environment where they're forced to follow rules to a T, are meant to be kind of obedient to authority and follow these kind of strictures, right? People with TBI also have higher rates of alcohol and drug abuse. And this makes a lot of sense, right? Especially for service members who've been through both physical and emotional pain and trauma. Your inhibitions are lowered because of the TBI, so you're more likely to do impulsive things like get really drunk while on duty or abuse drugs. And then at the same time, you could also be trying to self-medicate for the pain that you're experiencing, the physical pain, the emotional pain, and coping with what you've lost because of your brain injury. So it's very understandable that these rates are so high. So yeah, again, what all of this leads to is for service members to disobey orders, get into fights, use drugs, disappear for days at a time when they're not supposed to. And yeah, these are all things that are going to lead to a less than honorable discharge, right? And so what the government has gradually come to realize is that this creates a scenario that's totally unjust, right? You're basically punishing people for having suffered an injury while serving their country, and then for manifesting symptoms of that injury. So thankfully, in recent years, there have been a lot of changes to the rules that can help people get their statuses upgraded and reclaim the benefits and the veteran status that they're owed. But essentially what we're seeing is that we do see people still who are being discharged for behaviors that came from their TBI that they got while serving. All right, so I'm going to break down really quick the discharge categories. So there are five, actually there are six categories. I left out the sixth one because it's called uncharacterized. And that category is for people who leave the military after less than 6 months. So after their training is completed, but before they actually are considered active service members. But so there are these five major categories. The first category, which you're probably familiar with, is honorable. And most service members, about 60%, do receive honorable discharges. The category below that is called general under honorable, which is for people who served faithfully despite issues like minor disciplinary infractions or training failures. And then below that, you have other than honorable. And that's if you have kind of more serious patterns of misconduct or one kind of more serious incident of misbehavior. So those top three categories, honorable, general, and other than honorable, are considered administrative discharges. When you get below that, you have bad conduct and dishonorable discharges. So those are both considered punitive discharges. So bad conduct discharge is based on an offense like a DUI, like going AWOL, like being drunk on duty, these things that are considered, hazardous to your fellow service members and are serious offenses. Dishonorable discharge is for serious offenses that could involve prison time. So essentially, if you are dishonorably discharged, it's a situation where you've been court-martialed, where you've been convicted of some crime that you committed while serving. Sorry about the background noise. So these categories are what's listed on your DD-214. And the DD-214 is the paperwork that everyone gets when they leave the military. It's your certificate of release or discharge from active duty. So on that form, there are two very important pieces of information. The first one is the character of service, which is just which one of these 5 categories you were in when you were discharged. And then number 2 is the narrative reason for separation, which is listed below that. And so the narrative reason for separation is an explanation of why you were given this category. So if you were discharged other than honorably, that's the category, the character of service, and then the reason might say, drunk on duty, patterns of misconduct. So I do also just want to highlight that from a chart like this, you might think like, okay, if you have an administrative discharge, you're probably good. You can probably get most services, but that's really not the case. Anything less than honorable, you could have trouble getting certain types of veterans benefits. Like for instance, if you are discharged, if you have a general discharge, you are still entitled to VA medical and dental services, VA home loans, burial national cemeteries. You can get all of that, but you are not eligible for the post 9/11 GI Bill or educational benefits under the Montgomery Bill. So you're excluded from those categories, which are huge for a lot of people who are trying to seek higher education after service. And then the farther down the chart you go, the more likely it is that you're going to be denied kind of all veterans-based benefits. And that rolls into the next slide, which is about the importance of discharge status and what it means, what impact it has on your life after you've left the military. So bad paper discharge can mean that you are ineligible for certain VA benefits, which could include VA healthcare services and support for housing and things of that nature. And this can lead to really serious problems for people who served and are not getting the benefits that they need. First, increased suicide rates are a huge issue. In general, US military and veteran suicides occur at a rate of about 20 per day in the United States, which is unacceptably high in itself. In some categories, veteran suicides were 2 to 10 times higher than non-veteran suicides. And then within that, veterans who are discharged from misconduct have double the suicide rate of honorably discharged veterans. It's a very, very high rate. And oftentimes, they've done studies on this. These suicides, especially amongst the youngest age category of veterans, are attributed to either TBI or PTSD or a combination thereof. Veterans who are discharged other than honorably also have increased rates of homelessness and incarceration. You're 7 times more likely to be homeless if you are have a bad paper discharge. There are higher rates of incarceration and less or no access to veteran treatment courts as like a diversion court from the criminal justice system. You're also less likely to receive treatment while you're incarcerated or assistance re-entering the community once you've served your sentence, because these services are all things that are available to honorably discharged veterans. So, I mean, you can see from this just how unfair it is, right? If you're somebody who is discharged due to a TBI and you're prone to being suicidal and don't have access to therapy through the VA, or you're more likely to fall into poverty, to commit crimes, and then to not be given the benefits that are provided to other veterans in the criminal justice system. So that's a huge barrier. And just kind of what VA benefits encompass, right? It includes things like healthcare, it includes disability compensation, your military pension, your GI bills, home loans. It matters for your employability. It matters if you want to re-enlist. And then discharge statuses have also just like a less tangible importance, which is that if you are considered a veteran, if you served honorably, you're recognized as someone who served the country. And if you're discharged other than honorably, you do face that kind of stigma and that shame, both from other members of the military community and from the civilian world. A veteran might also run into questions about their discharge status when they're applying for jobs, when they're applying for benefits, obviously, when they're applying for certain community resources. Employers can ask for your DD-214 if they're an organization that gives preference to veterans when they're hiring. So all things like that can really cumulatively add up to a lot more issues for veterans with TBI. So the good news here is that you do have the right to appeal a other than honorable discharge. And it's kind of a complicated process. So I'm going to spend the next few slides kind of breaking down what that process looks like and how you can go through this appeals process. So in general, what you can do if you want to appeal your discharge status as having been unfair is that you can petition the Discharge Review Board for your branch or the Board for Correction of Records for your branch. And that would be a discharge upgrade. Just a side note, discharge upgrades are not the same thing as a character discharge review. A character discharge review can help you get benefits if you had a bad paper discharge, but what it's not going to do is it's not going to change the actual status that's written on your DD-214. And a discharge upgrade will. If you get a discharge upgrade, that previous status is erased completely and you're given the new higher status. So the discharge upgrades are all handled via the Department of Defense, and character discharge determinations are handled through the VA. So if you have a less than honorable discharge and you need access to VA services, it might make sense to apply for a character discharge determination, either at the same time as applying for an upgrade or just on its own. Because when you do that, it's through the VA, it's going to be faster and more efficient than applying for a full discharge upgrade. And you can apply for a character discharge review using the same evidence that you would use for an upgrade, showing that you had a TBI and that it affected your service. And we'll get into details about that in a few minutes. So what they do when they review that, they'll look at your record to figure out if your service was what they call honorable for VA purposes. And then they could give you the benefits. The review process could take up to a year, so it is still slow, but it's not quite as slow as going through the Department of Defense. And you can file a claim for VA benefits while you're waiting for your case to be heard by the DoD Review Board. And your claim could be granted during the time that your review board case is pending. So I would say that it is a good idea to file simultaneously if you're looking for an upgrade and a character of discharge review. This next chart, this chart specifically compares the Discharge Review Board and the Board for Correction of Records. So these are both ways to get a discharge upgrade, to get the whole paperwork, to get it replaced with a more beneficial status. So what's the difference between the two? So starting with the Discharge Review Board. So this board is comprised of 5 officers in the branch of service that's involved. And the Discharge Review Board has the power to change both the discharge status and the narrative reason, that second part of the DD-214 that explains why you were discharged. It can only change a discharge, it cannot change a court martial. There's a 15-year statute of limitations to apply for before the Discharge Review Board. You would apply using the form DD-293, and the evidence that you need to show is that the military made an error when they discharged you with the status that they give you. So did they follow their own rules in your discharge status? And that's impropriety. And did they assign you a fair characterization of discharge based on the totality of your service? In other words, did they behave equitably? So impropriety and inequity are the 2 categories there. And then the Board for Correction of Records is different. It's composed of civilian members of the respective departments who are appointed by the Secretary of the Department. So the Board for Correction of Military Records, they have the authority to do everything that the Discharge Review Boards do, and also much more. They can change anything on your discharge documents. They can change not just your status, your narrative reason. They can upgrade a character discharge that resulted from a court martial. They can change the narrative reason for separation to or from medical retirement. And they can make a wide range of changes to your medical records. And the Board for Correction of Records also has the power to reinstate someone into the military if they're seeking to be reinstated. And they can review a denial from the Discharge Review Board. So if you're seeking this remedy, you would need to go through the Discharge Review Board first. And then if you don't like their decision, you can go to the Board for Correction of Records. You can also just go to the Board for Correction of Records, but you can't do that in reverse. You can't go to the Board for Correction of Records, and then if you don't like their decision, you can't go back to the Discharge Review Board and ask for them to review it. So it only goes one way there. So the Board for Correction of Records can change whatever's on your documents. There's only a 3-year statute of limitations, so much shorter than a discharge review board. But they can hear any case, quote, in the interest of justice, which is broad. And so if you have a very compelling case, but you were discharged 10 years ago, that's not an absolute barrier. They still have the power to make these calls in the interest of justice. You apply using DD Form 149, and you will need to show evidence of error or injustice, which is fundamentally similar to the impropriety or inequity. Just did they make a mistake in discharging you the way they did, and was it unjust? When you apply, what does your application look like? So it helps to have an attorney or advocate put together an application package for you. But in general, kind of the components of this application, it would be a cover letter explaining your situation, and a personal statement that goes into, in this case, your TBI, how you sustained it, how it affected you, why you made the choices that you did that got you kicked out of the military, other than honorably. You would include your relevant military records, any relevant medical records you have, either both from during your service and after, evidence of your mental health diagnosis or your TBI diagnosis, a timeline of the major events that took place, and then evidence of good character since your discharge, right? Like, have you done things since your discharge that benefit the community, that show that you're a person of good character? Those are also things that they'll be looking at, which are, so you can see it's a mix of kind of these very concrete factors, and then also kind of these storytelling elements, right? This story that says, I am a good person, this is what happened to me, and here's what I'm doing now. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here about the changes that have been made in terms of people seeking discharge status upgrades for TBI and for other conditions. So as I mentioned earlier, the military has come to recognize that discharging people other than honorably because of their injury is unfair, and they are seeking to remedy that. So the CURTA memo is a Department of Defense memorandum that was released in 2017. It just got its name from the general who signed off on it, General CURTA. And so what it says is that these review boards are required to give you liberal consideration in your appeals case if you were discharged for reasons related to TBI, related to mental health conditions, including PTSD, or for reasons related to being the victim or survivor of sexual assault or sexual harassment while serving. What does liberal consideration mean? Basically what it means is that the board needs to consider all of your evidence, including the testimony from your family and friends, your own personal statement, your own explanation of what happened, rather than just looking at your medical records. And they need to be willing to give you the benefit of the doubt in these cases. And they also, crucially for people with TBI, they need to be looking at your TBI symptoms as mitigating factors rather than as willful misconduct. And that often requires educating the boards on why TBI caused you to behave the way you did. And so that can be an uphill battle, but this memo does help in that it kind of solidifies that the boards do need to be looking at this in a way that shows it was a mitigating factor rather than something you did willfully. So what is the board going to consider? Under the CURTA memo, they're required to consider 4 factors in deciding whether to grant you an upgrade. And these factors are if you have a condition or experience that may excuse or mitigate the discharge. So that's if you have a TBI in this case. So for that, you would need medical records, you would need a diagnosis. If the condition existed or the experience occurred during your military service. And again, that doesn't mean it had to be in combat. It could just be while you were serving, you got this injury, or the injury was worsened. If the condition or experience actually excuses or mitigates the discharge. So was your behavior fully within your control, or was your behavior influenced by your injury? And then if the condition or experience outweighs the reason for discharge, and that's a factor where that liberal consideration comes into play. They need to look at the totality of who you are and decide, should this person have been discharged with the status we gave them, or should it be upgraded? There are a couple of other recent Department of Defense memoranda that had similar kind of modifications to the board processes. One of them is called the Hagel memo, that was from 2014. And so what that did, which is interesting, is it waived the statute of limitations for PTSD related cases before the Board for Correction of Records. And it also requires liberal consideration for PTSD in service if the symptoms are in your service records or in your service treatment records. And it also provides for liberal consideration for civilian provider diagnoses. So if you were not diagnosed with PTSD by a VA doctor, but were diagnosed by a civilian doctor, they still need to give that liberal consideration as well. There's the Carson memo from 2016, which had a whole bunch of things to it, but the one that's relevant here is that it specifically mentions TBI as a condition that's related to PTSD and that should be treated similarly in terms of granting people upgrades. There was also the last one here, 2018, the Wilkie memo, and that purpose was to kind of clarify the standards. I talked earlier about inequity, injustice. These are very vague terms, so it kind of sought to clarify what does inequity mean, what is injustice, and so basically to help the boards make more consistent and more fair decisions. This memo also put an emphasis on second chances and kind of rehabilitation, and it spells out kind of specific factors for weighing the mitigating value of issues that occurred in service, and then your kind of conduct and achievements. And it specifically includes post-service conduct and achievements as the criteria that boards should use, should look at when determining whether to grant you an upgrade. So again, if you went on to become a model citizen, that's going to count in your favor. All right, so this is something different from the discharge status upgrades, but something that people in New York should be aware of. It's a very recent bill. It was passed in 2019 and just took effect last year. It's the New York State Restoration and Honor Act. So this is a way to get your benefits, your New York State benefits restored if you're a service member who is discharged other than honorably. So under this law, you can apply to have your benefits restored if you were discharged, if you were denied an honorable discharge due to your sexual orientation, your gender identity, due to military sexual trauma, TBI, or PTSD. And this will help you basically regain your New York State benefits without having to go through the discharge status process. So it doesn't change anything on your DD 214. It's not the federal government at all. It is just the New York State government. But there are a lot of veteran benefits in New York State that are specific to the state. There are tuition awards, public housing benefits, property tax exemptions for veterans, burial and state veteran cemeteries, various kinds of state fees are waived. So it's these things can absolutely add up to a improved quality of life. So this is something where if you're in the situation, is very much worth looking into. And so what is that going to look like? What are you going to need to include if you're applying for restoration of honor? So you're going to need the application, which is available on their website, your official military personnel file, a personal statement, which is similar to the one you would write in a discharge status upgrade case, right? It's describing why your character of service was unjust and why an upgrade to a higher character is appropriate. And then if you do have a letter verifying that you have a service-connected rating for your disability, you should include that. And there are also additional things you might want to include if you're applying based on a TBI. So if you're applying based on TBI, you're going to need evidence of that diagnosis, either from a Veterans Health Administration doctor or a VHA affiliated provider. And you're going to need evidence, again, similar to the discharge upgrades, evidence showing that your disability occurred during service or worsened during service. So that could be, you got your first and only TBI while you served, or you had previously had TBIs, and then you got a concussion while serving, and that made everything worse. You would need a written explanation of how your TBI led to your less than honorable discharge. And then again, if applicable, if you have a service-connected disability rating, include that. So there's more information available online, and you can also email questions to inclusion@veterans.ny.gov if you want to ask specifically about your case. So representation and representation resources. So like I said, this process is tricky, it's complicated. It looks like maybe it won't be like maybe you just have to fill out some forms, but there really is kind of an art to it and a list of things that you're really going to need in terms of your medical records and what the application should look like. So there are organizations specifically that help that provide pro bono advocacy and resources to former service members who are seeking status upgrades. Several of them are listed here. There are also law school clinics across the state that provide advocacy and representation in these cases. So those are worth seeking out, and I can send around a resource list. Sorry. And just for any of these, basically, you might be thinking, is this just an application that I send in, or am I going to have to appear in court or in some kind of formal setting? So there's both. There are two types of reviews. There is a documentary record review and a personal appearance hearing. So a documentary record review is when you send in that application packet. It's all written. You send off all these documents, and then they'll evaluate it. If they do not grant you the relief that you're seeking, then you can ask for a personal appearance hearing. So you can go and then appear in person and state your case. You can have an advocate or an attorney to represent you in front of the board. If you request a personal appearance hearing first, you can't then go back and apply for a documentary record review. So the order should be that you apply for the documentary record review first, and then if you get a negative decision, then ask for a personal appearance hearing. So that is something to keep in mind. And that is the end of the main portion of the presentation. What I do want to do now is, in a moment, going to open the floor to Q&A. And I wanted to mention that I've been working closely with Loretta Kramer, who's here in the room. She is an intern at DRNY. She's a law student, and she has worked with a clinic that provides representation to veterans seeking discharge status upgrades. So she's also here, and I spoke with her, and she might be able to answer some questions. I'm not putting her on the spot. If it is a question that she can't answer or I can't answer, we'll research it and get back to you. But hopefully we will be able to assist. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now. All right, great. Thank you guys so much for sitting through that presentation. I hope it was informative and not too confusing. The good news is, if it was confusing, we have 18 minutes left that we've reserved this room for, so you guys can ask some questions. So I will open the floor to that now. Also, not just questions, if you have comments, if you have corrections, if you have personal stories related to this topic, the floor is also open to those. I guess, Loretta, not to put you, well, yes, to put you on the spot. Sorry, I'm going to do that. If you could speak briefly about your experiences in the clinic, that might be really helpful for people to hear about, kind of what the work you did, the work that your professor did, kind of what you're seeing in terms of trends in this area.
Okay, yeah. So mostly we do discharge upgrades. Most of the time it involves looking back at veterans' materials, paperwork from when they were in the military, going back and seeing, when a certain injury began, and kind of going through the law and kind of building a case and saying this started in the military and it's continuing, and they've shown symptoms since then. Most of the time it takes usually around a semester, so 3 months to kind of get everything together. And then you usually hear back a few months later about how it's going. And sometimes they invite the veteran in to speak in front of a panel, or sometimes the lawyers will go with you and kind of help speak on your behalf and present the case as a full story. It's a lot of the work is telling a full story and saying, this is what happened to me and this is why I deserve better coverage or better benefits, and this is why I was given the wrong discharge status.
Thanks, Loretta. And what was the name of that clinic, or which law school, in case people want to reach out with questions or to ask for that?
So I go to Hofstra Law, so that is the Robert Entenmann Clinic.
Great. So that's actually one of the ones that was listed on the slide.
Yes.
Which I can send around. But yeah, that's a great clinic that does really fantastic advocacy, both the students and the attorneys.
Yeah, it's a great clinic.
Anybody else have questions? Or commentary. If not, we can also wrap up quickly. But yes,
sure. Or maybe just maybe some guidance. I don't know if hopefully my Disability Rights Florida logo is the correct way. I think sometimes that thing gets split, but I work at Disability Rights Florida and do the Pat V grant here, and then just looking at different ways to do outreach. I've reached out to a lot of, the support groups around the country, or at least around Florida, and, made some contacts and tried to make some inroads there, and have started looking at, this population as well, the veterans with TBIs, and I know some of the PNAs, or at least NDRNs, looking at some veteran type grants as well. But maybe just any thoughts on, how approaching groups, veterans groups, maybe specifically, or just folks with TBIs and the support groups, professionals. I've gotten some bites over the last month that I've been really focusing on doing some outreach and trying to make some inroads, and trying to be a part of boards that help folks with TBIs. So figured since there was some silence, I'd at least ask that if there's some thoughts that folks could share.
Definitely. No, that's a fantastic question. And it can be really hard to reach veterans with TBI as a specific population that can be, like I said, vulnerable to homelessness and situations like that. So reaching out even to advocates for the homeless or advocates for veterans experiencing homelessness could be a good resource. I'm trying to think what else. There are various other kind of legal clinics that provide these services, because some of them are not necessarily state specific. They might be able to help people across the country. I know Loretta, I think your Professor Blair had mentioned that they actually represent people from all across the country. So yeah, I guess reaching out to that. I mean, this is something that we've worked on as well, and it is kind of hard to outreach to the communities. But I know that there are a lot of people who really need these hearings and really want to be advocated for. Chrissy, did you want to speak to that?
Hi, I'm Christy Asby. I am I'm a program director at Disability Rights New York, and I'm not going to lie. We've been working years to try to build connections. It's an uphill battle. It takes perseverance. It takes constant communication, reaching out to veteran service organizations that are doing the benefits work, the application work. That's an important relationship to have. Working with any state agency that's serving the population that, typically it's for veterans, right? So there's a disconnect. So I think that, covering all bases, between homelessness advocates and on the ground advocacy work, to your state agencies, that spectrum is where you have to sort of hunt for the individuals that are impacted. So it's just, if you're experiencing some fatigue in this area, you're not alone. We're all together. And, we can just share I just always encourage people to share any sort of efforts and, successes and failures.
I would think too, Christina, what I've recognized, it's difficult. Some successes I had were with actual professionals that are doing the support groups, and kind of making that connective, sharing of information, at least letting them know what our agency could do, not, that could benefit their clients. But I know I'm not an attorney, but the person I work for is, and we've discussed, he volunteers, for the one of the local veteran homeless legal clinics. So he's even though this isn't geared towards folks with disabilities, disparately enough, there's that disproportionate amount of folks who are homeless that have some disabilities. So, and there's probably a piece of that population with traumatic brain injuries as well that are veterans. So I think that's going to be one of our next kind of hopeful kind of areas, like she mentioned, Amanda mentioned, that the homeless population, maybe trying to make some inroads there and get some success. But I've been listening to these things as well for at least 2 or 3 years, different webinars and the TBI Tuesdays, where folks can actually with TBIs can tell their stories, and those are so enlightening. But you just see all the the difficulties of making connections and the, not having permanent addresses sometimes and follow up and reminders and just things that are, in line with that disability. I certainly appreciate any guidance, like you said, anything that might work to be a part of that advocacy for that group,
Absolutely, and that's something that even has gotten harder during the pandemic, because you can't just go to shelters and to veteran service groups and kind of do presentations in person or hand out flyers. And a lot of it ends up being online, which people might not have access to, especially in these communities. Also, Fritz, I'm just going to put my email address in the chat. This is for everyone, but if you do want to reach out to me later to talk about this or to brainstorm ideas, strategies, I would love to take part in that.
Thank you.
Erica asked a really good question in the chat. She said, when the vets are making their cases, such as via the clinic, do they feel heard during this process, or have you gotten the sense that they feel like they're simply jumping through hoops? Wondering if there's a sense of understanding from the folks receiving these appeals. So that would go to Loretta, I think, because you've done a couple of these, could probably attest to that.
Yeah, this is a good question, because I think the law school clinics really help veterans, because there's some guidance and some kind of, we're making forward progress, because a lot of veterans get frustrated. They feel like they get stuck at a certain part in the procedure where they just feel like they get to hurdles that they can't overcome. So having the guidance of not just, the law students are learning as they go, but we're guided by attorneys that do know what they're doing. So kind of having that guidance, it is a little more reassuring that someone is helping them, that they're going to get through this. And in my experience, I usually met with my clients either once or twice a week to keep them updated on how it was going. And there's not really a lot of resources for veterans. So having that kind of hands-on help on a regular basis seemed to really put our veterans in a better headspace and a better feeling that somebody was taking control of the case and helping them tell their story and kind of illustrate their narrative the way that they wanted it seen by the VA.
Thanks, Loretta. Yeah, I think that's huge. Just if you're going up in a situation with the military, you're dealing with this very dense and impersonal bureaucracy. And so it really does help to have someone on your side who's going to listen to your story, whether it's an advocate or an attorney. That's going to be hugely helpful. I am sure just emotionally bolstering you as well as providing the kind of legal guidance. So Christy also put in the chat a resource that we created here at DRNY, which is a upgrade handbook, which covers substantially covers the information I gave in this presentation, but in a nicely organized handbook form. So that's something that if you guys want to check that out, it kind of describes the different types of upgrades and then additional things like the character of discharge determinations and restoration of honor. So those are all available on our website.
Joe Clark from Disability Rights New York had a comment. He said it's in the chat, so Joe is the program director for the REP program at DRNY. So he just made a comment that said in the SSD hearing days, back when he did a lot of that work, said a less than honorable discharge often led to an unfavorable decision because the ALJ, the administrative law judge that oversees these Social Security appeals, they would find that the vet is not credible. So that is a real component, and it's an important piece to this whole message that Amanda is sharing and Loretta are sharing with us today. Also important to note, just to piggyback on your Amanda, your comment about the discharge status handbook that you created. It is geared for individuals with TBI as well as their family and advocates. It's in as plain of language as we could draft it. So it's a resource that is not for the not necessarily for attorneys or the sort of more specialized advocates. It's really for the community so that this process can be as easily understood as you can possibly make it.
Thanks, Christy. And yeah, just to Joe's comment, like that's so outrageous, but not surprising. Like many things in the system, it just, it seems like when somebody is viewed as a dishonorable discharge or other than honorable, that they really do get that bias and that prejudice from all corners. So I guess including the ALJs, which is unfortunate. We only have a couple minutes left. Does anybody have kind of a closing question or comment they want to address? Okay, well, I really appreciate you guys coming out to watch this. It's an issue that, again, we've been really passionate about here, this project. And I also just want to thank Loretta for being a great partner in this over the summer and for the work she's done in the clinic and with us as a DRNY intern. So thanks, Loretta. And yeah, thank you all for being here. If you do have any questions or want to talk further about any of these issues, my email address is in the chat. Feel free to reach out.